like I could when I was small, and it's so picturesque. Looking through the crystal ball, can you picture this? And it isn't sad at all.
Ciao and welcome to Gio's Paintbrush, where 5 minutes is all it takes to be blown away by one of the world's greatest artists. In today's show, we'll consider a contemporary public sculpture by German artist Stephan Balkenhol called Sphaera, placed in Salzburg, Austria's Kapitelplatz in 2007. Balkenhol, born in 1957, is known for his rather blank, seemingly emotionless human figures, usually placed quite matter-of-factly, even casually, in unusual and precarious circumstances, surprising people who come across them all across Europe. Dana and I encountered this work on a self-guided walk of Salzburg's wonderful Old Town in June of 2011. And when you first set foot on historic Kapitelplatz, well, let's just say Sphaera is hard to miss. Thanks for joining us.
So there he is, a man of about average height, average weight, dressed plainly in black slacks and a white shirt, dark hair, standing rather comfortably with feet firmly planted on the ground, and a casual, distant air about him, on a giant golden orb, itself resting on a black three-legged steel frame that serves as a pedestal. And this plain, curious figure, atop the golden orb, holds a prominent position in Salzburg's Old Town, on Kapitelplatz, next to the 17th century Baroque cathedral in which Mozart was baptized, below the 11th century city guardian called Hohensalzburg Fortress, high on a hill, and nearby St. Peter's Cemetery and Catacombs, dating to 1627 and immortalized in the 1965 Hollywood film The Sound of Music. When one takes in this plot or square in person, the initial reaction is, or at least mine was, what the hell is that? Like most contemporary artists, Balkenhol insists that those who experience his sculptures participate in the process, enter into some sort of dialogue with the work, bringing his or her own associations and memories and intellectual or emotional responses to bear, with the sculptor providing starting points, to be sure, but no evidence of a clear-cut, ready interpretation. So let's play the game the way it was intended, by starting with my own response to the intentionally broad, vague, perhaps even elusive shapes, forms, and figures Balkenhol does provide. Beginning with the man atop the orb, does his neutrality, a complete absence of emotion or expression, a distant blankness, despite what one would think would be a somewhat awkward, uncomfortable, maybe even dangerous position atop this giant orb, is it intended to signify his everyman status, representative of all humanity and our shared position, tenuous, uncertain, misplaced, lacking control, but now numbed to that set of circumstances, indifferent or no longer capable of recognizing or feeling? It certainly places humanity in a humbling position, isolated, maybe even helpless, but it also suggests we're either completely unaware of the fragile position we hold or indifferent to it. On the other hand, could this average Joe atop a golden orb, rather than symbolize every man, be a commentary on a certain type of person, perhaps a corporate type, or an academician, or an office worker, or men, or people of the Western world? Certainly this so-called everyman is not a woman, is not of color, and is attired in what the Western world considers the plainest of clothing. Perhaps the color contrast his clothing presents, black and white, darkness and light, is intended to reinforce the sharp contrast between the figure's expression, as well as his general demeanor, and his tenuous, almost absurd existentialist predicament. More likely, though, the colors are intended to reinforce the complete absence of an emotional response on the figure's part, with no color, no pattern, no sense of individuality. And what's with the orb? Certainly it calls to mind the shape of the earth itself, in which case our friend is standing literally on top of the world, in some type of other dimension, possessing a scale in relation to the earth that enlarges humanity, or at least this guy, to giant status. Maybe he's the artist himself. Perhaps he's removed himself from the world, withdrawn, distant, without emotion or connection, and entered a space where an artist can better see what's going on around him, can gain the perspective and the distance needed to communicate something of relevance for his time and his place. Could this sculpture be a metaphor for the artistic process then? The act of creation? In this sense, the golden hue of the orb could represent the value, the worth of this act, as well as the artist's ability to recognize and create beauty from this otherworldly perch, this place of distance and perspective. A key question I have about this sculpture is whether the man is intended to be stranded on top of it in a tough spot, reflected of humankind's current standing in the universe perhaps, or is he above it all, on top of the world, and afforded a unique and enlarged view, or can it be both simultaneously? Locally, many in Salzburg observed that the orb, as a shape, calls to mind the city's world-famous Mozart balls, an orb-shaped candy of pistachio, marzipan, and nougat, dating to the 19th century, popular with visitors to Salzburg and candy aficionados worldwide. At least one critic has gone so far as to wonder whether this connection to local lore and the city's identity and economy encouraged Salzburgers to go easy on the sculpture, placed somewhat shockingly in their beloved old town. And to be sure, Sphaera cuts an incongruous figure on Baroque Kapitelplatz, with the historic cathedral, the bishop's palace, the offices of Salzburg University, and the imposing hill and Hohensalzburg fortress looming over it all. But in a way, the grand scale of the square's buildings and the sheer size of the public space in the center lends itself to the piece, providing a larger context beyond the work itself, reinforcing the notion of the man's isolation, and maybe even helping communicate something interesting about the relativity of scale. While the figure stands perched supersized, out of proportion, atop what might be the entire planet, the work as a whole, man and orb, seem dwarfed in size by the buildings, the square, the hill, and the fortress. Perhaps perspective is a bit harder to obtain after all, and understanding our own place in the universe and our relationship to it is a continual, endless process, full of ambiguity and relativity and questions as opposed to answers. And Balkenhol, it seems to me, is insistent that whatever answers can be found are personal, individual responses to the world. Just as the viewer experiencing Sphaera must contribute his or her own interpretation of the expressionless figure to lend it any meaning or value. Maybe the whole point is that we all, as individuals, must embark on this same process every day. Increasingly, I see similarity between Balkenhol's work and the existentialists, as if he's a Beckett or Sartre, working not with words, but with sculpture, and large public sculpture at that. And the title, Sphaera, a Latin noun of Greek origin that means globe, ball, or sphere, suggests that Balkenhol does not see this sculpture as relevant to the contemporary world alone, but in choosing an ancient title, it broadens the scope of the piece, stretching across millennia. This is a fun, thought-provoking work, a contemporary surprise in Old Town Salzburg, and I'm glad Dana and I were able to experience it in person last summer. Grazie mille e ciao.